This is a travesty! I will not stand for this! You hear me? I own this city!
Have you ever watched the evening news, seen a smug, arrogant defendant walk out of a courtroom with nothing but a slap on the wrist, and felt your blood absolutely boil? You sit there in your living room, staring at the screen, and a heavy thought crosses your mind. Is this what our justice system has become? A punchline for the rich and reckless? For decades, you and I have been told to trust the process. We play by the rules, we pay our taxes, and we teach our children to do the right thing. But when you see the same entitled individuals manipulating the very laws meant to protect us, it feels like a betrayal. It feels like the system is rigged against honest, hardworking Americans. You are not alone in feeling that deep, quiet anger. That frustration is completely valid. But what if I told you about a courtroom where the manipulation stops? A place where money, arrogance, and high-priced attorneys absolutely cannot save you. Welcome to the courtroom of Judge Boyd. This is not your ordinary courtroom. And Judge Boyd is certainly not a man who entertains legal theatrics. He doesn't just interpret the law. He enforces personal accountability with a cold, uncompromising clarity that strips away all illusions of power. Today's case is the perfect example. It involves a man who firmly believed he was untouchable. Let's call him Marcus Vance. Marcus was a wealthy, influential developer who had spent the last 15 years treating the legal system like his own personal doormat. He had accumulated a staggering list of severe violations, defrauding elderly investors, ignoring critical safety protocols, and ruining the livelihoods of small, honest contractors. And yet, every single time he faced a judge, he slipped through the cracks. He would confidently stride into court wearing a custom-tailored suit, flash a predatory smile, pay a fine that was nothing more than pocket change to him, and walk right back out to continue his schemes. For Marcus, the justice system wasn't a boundary. It was just a minor toll booth on his highway of greed. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought the law was blind, deaf, and easily bought. But Marcus Vance made one fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He assumed the man sitting behind the elevated bench today was just another tired official waiting to be bored into submission. When Marcus strolled through those heavy oak courtroom doors, he didn't even bother to take off his expensive sunglasses. He casually adjusted his gold watch, completely unaware that the atmosphere in this specific room was fundamentally different. There was no nervous shuffling of papers. There were no side conversations in the gallery. There was only a heavy, suffocating, terrifying silence, because sitting up there, looking down at him with a gaze that could cut through solid steel, was Judge Boyd. And Judge Boyd does not play games with the truth. As Marcus smirked at his defense attorney, you could almost feel the collective breath of the courtroom hitch. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The exact second where a millionaire's fantasy of being untouchable was about to crash headfirst into the crushing reality of true justice. Marcus Vance's defense attorney, a high-profile lawyer named Richard Sterling, stepped confidently up to the podium. Sterling was a man who made his living by turning the law into a confusing labyrinth, exhausting prosecutors until they simply gave up. He had a perfectly polished smile and a briefcase overflowing with legal loopholes. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice dripping with practiced arrogance, "my client is prepared to accept responsibility. We have already negotiated a settlement with the state, a fine of $200,000, and a promise to rectify these minor administrative oversights. We believe this is a fair and expeditious resolution. $200,000. For a man like Marcus, who lived in a sprawling mansion and flew on private jets, that wasn't a punishment. It was merely a modest business expense. It was a meaningless slap on the wrist for destroying the lives of dozens of hardworking families. In the gallery behind him, you could hear the quiet, stifled gasps of the victims who had shown up today. They came hoping for justice, but deep down, they were expecting the same old disappointment. They had lost their life savings, their small businesses, and their dignity, all because of the so-called administrative oversights of the man standing so casually before the bench. Judge Boyd did not reach for the paperwork Sterling proudly presented. He didn't even blink. He leaned forward slowly, resting his hands on the heavy mahogany desk. The silence in the room stretched out, taut and fragile, like a wire about to snap. Mr. Sterling, Boyd's voice finally resonated through the courtroom, deep, calm, and terrifyingly cold. You seem to be under the severe misconception that this courtroom is a marketplace. You are attempting to negotiate a bulk discount for your client's habitual, unrepentant fraud. Sterling's polished smile faltered slightly. He adjusted his tie. Your Honor, legal precedent clearly dictates. Precedent, Boyd interrupted, his tone slicing through the lawyer's defense like a surgical blade, is a tool for interpreting the law. It is not a shield for predators who consistently mock it. Your client didn't commit an oversight, counselor. He orchestrated a calculated, vicious campaign against vulnerable people who trusted him. He looked working-class families in the eye, shook their hands, and then systematically drained their futures to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Marcus Vance shifted his weight, the very first sign of genuine discomfort cracking his arrogant facade. He took off his expensive sunglasses and glared at his lawyer, expecting Sterling to fix it, to throw up another legal smokescreen. But Sterling was frozen. Judge Boyd picked up the state's settlement file, held it up for the entire room to see, and then casually dropped it into the trash can beside his desk. The heavy thud echoed loudly against the walls. The state's negotiated fine is rejected, Boyd declared, his eyes locking onto Marcus. We are not doing business today, Mr. Vance. We are doing justice. The courtroom was so intensely quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Marcus Vance stared at the trash can where his carefully negotiated get-out-of-jail-free card had just been discarded. For the first time in his privileged life, the color drained entirely from his face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his expensive silk tie. Your Honor, Marcus finally spoke, his voice lacking the commanding boom of a corporate CEO. It was thinner, laced with a sudden, desperate edge. I can pay more, whatever the state feels is appropriate. $500,000, $1 million even, donated to a charity of your choice right now. Judge Boyd did not look impressed. In fact, his eyes narrowed, turning as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. You still do not understand, do you, Mr. Vance? You firmly believe that your wealth is a universal currency for forgiveness. You think you can just write a bigger check to wash away the devastation you've caused. But let me tell you exactly what your money cannot buy. Boyd reached across his desk and picked up a different file, not the neat, thin settlement folder, but a massive, overflowing binder filled with handwritten letters and financial statements. This, Boyd said, holding it up, is Mrs. Eleanor Higgins' file. She is 74 years old. Because of your deliberate administrative oversights in the Valley Ridge construction project, she lost her entire retirement fund, a fund she and her late husband built over 40 years of backbreaking labor. Because of you, Mrs. Higgins now works as a greeter at a local grocery store, standing on her swollen feet for 8 hours a day, just to afford her heart medication. Marcus nervously shifted his gaze to the floor. I didn't know her personally, Your Honor. It was a corporate decision. That is precisely the problem, Boyd's voice suddenly boomed, echoing like thunder against the wooden walls. You insulate yourself with high-priced lawyers and offshore accounts, so you never have to look your victims in the eye. You treat human lives, hard-working American families, as acceptable collateral damage on your corporate balance sheet. But let me make this abundantly clear. In my courtroom, your balance sheet means absolutely nothing. Here, the only acceptable currency is accountability. The gallery remained utterly silent, but the emotional weight in the room was shifting dramatically. The victims, who had sat with their heads bowed in defeat just moments ago, were slowly sitting up straighter. For the first time in their lives, they were watching an untouchable predator realize that the trap had finally snapped shut. You are going to do something you have never done, Mr. Vance, Boyd commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. You are going to turn around, and you are going to look at the people whose lives you dismantled. Marcus Vance hesitated. His highly paid lawyer, Richard Sterling, instinctively reached out to grab his arm, a desperate attempt to protect his client from this unorthodox humiliation. Your Honor, I must respectfully object. My client is not legally required to participate in this kind of theatrical. Sit down, counselor. Boyd's voice cracked like a whip, silencing the lawyer instantly. The sheer authority in the room was absolute. or I will have the bailiff seat you. This is not theater. This is the reality your client has been actively running from for 15 years. He is going to face the consequences of his actions, and he is going to do it right now. Slowly, painfully, as if the air itself had grown heavy, Marcus Vance turned around. The gallery was packed. Dozens of eyes stared back at him. These weren't the faceless statistics on his quarterly earnings reports. These were real people. He saw an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane, his face etched with decades of exhaustion. He saw a young mother holding a toddler, her jaw set in quiet, dignified fury. And in the second row, he saw Mrs. Higgins. She was wearing a faded floral blouse, clutching a worn handbag tightly to her chest. Her eyes weren't filled with explosive rage. They were filled with a profound, piercing sorrow that hit harder than any angry shout ever could. "Look at them, mister." "Vance," Boyd commanded from the bench, his voice resonating through the tense air, ensuring that every single word landed with maximum impact. "You spent years building a fortress of wealth, convincing yourself that you were a titan of industry. But true titans build things up. You are nothing but a scavenger. You feasted on the trust and the sweat of these hardworking people. You looked at Mrs. Higgins' retirement fund, a lifetime of honest labor, and you saw nothing but a down payment for your third vacation home." Marcus tried to avert his eyes, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. The perfectly tailored Italian suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. The arrogant, untouchable smirk that had defined him for decades was completely eradicated, replaced by the naked, undeniable look of a man who was finally cornered. "Yes, I apologize," Marcus stammered, his voice trembling. The words sounded incredibly hollow and pathetic as they stumbled from his lips. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt." "Intent does not rebuild a shattered life," Boyd replied coldly, the absolute finality in his tone making it crystal clear that the time for cheap apologies had long passed. "An apology is just empty breath. Justice, Mr. Vance, requires sacrifice." Marcus Vance stared up at the bench, his perfectly manicured hands gripping the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. The word sacrifice hung in the air, heavy and ominous. For a man who had spent his entire life taking from others, the concept of personal sacrifice was entirely foreign. His lawyer, Richard Sterling, was frantically whispering in his ear, likely planning an immediate appeal. But Marcus couldn't hear him. All he could hear was the deafening silence of a courtroom waiting for the hammer to fall. "You offered $1 million a few minutes ago, Mr. Vance," Judge Boyd said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You offered it casually, like spare change, hoping to buy your way out of this room. Let me tell you what is actually going to happen. I am rejecting your plea deal entirely. Furthermore, under the state's restitution laws regarding deliberate financial fraud, I am ordering the immediate freezing and total liquidation of your personal assets." Marcus gasped, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. You can't do that. My accounts, my properties, the vacation home in Aspen, the yacht, the offshore holdings you thought were so cleverly hidden," Boyd continued, his voice slicing through the defendant's panic with absolute precision. "Every single cent of your liquid wealth will be seized by the state and placed into a direct restitution fund. Your victims will be made whole today. Mrs. Higgins will have her retirement account fully restored, with compounding interest, by the end of this month." A sudden, collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. Behind Marcus, a woman began to sob quietly, not out of pain, but out of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the sound of a heavy, suffocating burden finally being lifted. "But returning what you stole is not a punishment," Boyd declared, leaning forward, his eyes burning with absolute authority. "That is merely balancing the scales. You cannot buy your way out of the trauma you inflicted. For the deliberate, systematic destruction of these hardworking American families, society demands a penalty. And it will not be served in a comfortable, white-collar resort where you can play tennis on the weekends." Boyd picked up his gavel. "Marcus Vance, I sentence you to 15 years in the maximum security state penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. You will serve every single day of that sentence and you will do it alongside the very people you once believed you were better than. The sound of the gavel striking the wood echoed like a definitive gunshot, signaling the absolute end of Marcus Vance's reign of manipulation. For a full 10 seconds, nobody moved. The heavily armed bailiffs stepped forward, their expressions completely neutral, but the rest of the courtroom was frozen in a state of profound, collective shock. Marcus himself seemed physically incapable of processing the words he had just heard. 15 years, no early parole, no comfortable minimum security resort, and absolute financial ruin. His highly paid attorney, Richard Sterling, slowly closed his expensive leather briefcase. The click of the brass locks sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. There were no more loopholes to exploit, no more backroom deals to negotiate. The shield of wealth had been completely shattered, and Sterling knew better than to argue with Judge Boyd when the gavel had already fallen. He took one distinct step away from his client, a subtle but devastating physical acknowledgement that Marcus Vance was now entirely on his own. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody, Judge Boyd instructed, his voice as calm and steady as a deep, unmoving river. As the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Marcus's wrists, a sound he never, in his wildest nightmares, imagined applying to himself, the atmosphere in the gallery finally broke. But it wasn't a chaotic eruption of cheers or loud applause. It was something far more powerful. It was a wave of quiet, overwhelming validation. Men and women who had spent 15 years feeling completely invisible, feeling like the system had abandoned them in favor of the rich and powerful, were openly weeping. They clung to each other, their tears washing away decades of bitter resentment and profound despair. Mrs. Higgins, the 74-year-old widow who had lost everything, stood up slowly from the second row. She didn't bother to look at Marcus as he was being led away, his designer Italian suit suddenly looking like a ridiculous, oversized costume on a broken man. Instead, she looked directly up at the bench. She didn't say a single word, but she didn't have to. Her pale blue eyes met Judge Boyd's, conveying a lifetime of heavy gratitude. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't just a discarded casualty on a corporate spreadsheet. She was an American citizen who had been fiercely protected by the law. Judge Boyd met her gaze and gave a single respectful nod. He didn't smile. True justice isn't about celebration. It is about restoration and accountability. He simply picked up his pen, closed the massive file on his desk, and looked out over the remaining attendees. The message he had just sent rippled out far beyond those wooden walls. It was a warning shot fired across the bow of every arrogant predator who thought their bank account made them immune to the consequences of their actions. As the heavy oak courtroom doors swung shut behind Marcus Vance, swallowing the very last remnants of his arrogance, a profound shift occurred in the air. The oppressive, cynical weight that had hung over the gallery for hours finally evaporated. People didn't rush to leave. They lingered, speaking in hushed, reverent tones. It was as if they had just witnessed a violent storm finally break, leaving behind a crisp, clean, undeniable truth. Judge Boyd remained at the bench, calmly organizing his files. He didn't seek their applause, nor did he offer a comforting, political smile. His presence alone was the comfort. He was the anchor in a legal system that had, for far too long, felt like a ship adrift in a sea of corporate influence. For decades, you and I have been quietly conditioned to accept a bitter, unspoken rule. Justice has a premium price tag, and if you cannot afford it, you simply have to settle for whatever scraps the system decides to throw at you. We watch the evening news, we see the wealthy exploit the working class, and we swallow that familiar, burning pill of complete helplessness. We tell ourselves that this is just the way the world works. But what happened in Judge Boyd's courtroom today wasn't just a sentencing, it was a massive societal awakening. It was a brutal, necessary reminder that the law, in its purest, most untainted form, is the ultimate equalizer. It absolutely does not care about the thread count of your designer suit or the inflated balance of your offshore accounts. Boyd's gavel didn't just smash Marcus Vance's fraudulent empire, it completely shattered the toxic illusion of the untouchable elite. The core lesson here isn't merely that bad people eventually get punished. It is much deeper and far more important than that. It is the realization that true accountability requires unyielding, terrifying courage from those who sit in positions of immense power. Judge Boyd demonstrated that when the system operates with absolute, incorruptible integrity, it actually has the power to heal. It has the power to take a 4-year-old widow, stripped of her dignity and her life savings, and restore her entirely, not just financially, but spiritually. It gives her back her name, her hard-earned peace, and her rightful, respected place in American society. As the bailiff called for order to bring in the next case, the victims slowly filed out of the courtroom. They walked differently now. Their shoulders were pulled back, their heads held high. They had walked into that building as forgotten casualties of corporate greed, but they were walking out as victorious, vindicated citizens. They had finally seen the face of true, uncompromising justice, and for the first time in a very long time, they believed in it again. We live in a world that constantly tries to tell us that the little guy can never win. We are bombarded every single day with headlines about corporate bailouts, secret settlements, and wealthy elites who seem to float effortlessly above the laws that govern the rest of us. It is so incredibly easy to become cynical. It is easy to look at the evening news, shake your head, and accept that the game is forever rigged against the working class. But the story of Judge Boyd and Marcus Vance proves something undeniably powerful. It proves that the armor of wealth is never completely impenetrable. It proves that when the right person sits on the bench, a person who cannot be bought, intimidated, or swayed by high-priced defense attorneys, true justice is not just a distant fantasy. It is a terrifying reality for those who believe they are untouchable. Mrs. Higgins didn't just get her retirement fund back that day. She got her voice back. And in a way, everyone sitting in that courtroom got their voice back too. They remembered what it feels like to live in a society where the law is actually meant to protect them, not just police them. Judge Boyd didn't just hand down a prison sentence. He handed down a profound restoration of faith in the American justice system. Now, I want to ask you a serious question. When was the last time you saw a story like this on your mainstream local news? The media loves to highlight the failures of our system, but they rarely show us the moments when the hammer of absolute accountability strikes true. That is exactly why I share these specific stories with you, because we desperately need to be reminded that real, unyielding justice still exists. If you are tired of watching a two-tiered justice system, and if you firmly believe that every single American, regardless of the size of their bank account, should face the exact same scales of justice, then please hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who needs a powerful reminder that the arrogant elites don't always win. Leave a comment below and let me know, do you agree with Judge Boyd's sentence, or do you think Marcus Vance deserved even worse? Thank you for spending your time with me today. Remember, justice isn't just a theoretical ideal we hope for. It is a rigid standard we must demand. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never stop demanding the truth.